Welcome back to the channel, History Hunters. Today we are cracking open the strangest rulebook ever written in stone. Ancient Egypt gave us pyramids, mummies, and gods with animal heads, but it also gave us laws so bizarre you will question how this civilization lasted 3,000 years. Stick around because rule number 1 alone will change how you see the pharaohs forever. 1. You could not harm a cat under any circumstances, and the punishment for killing one, even by accident, was death. Cats were considered living embodiments of the goddess Bastet, and Egyptian households treated them with a reverence usually reserved for royalty. When a family cat died, every human in the house shaved off their eyebrows as a public sign of mourning, and they kept those brows shaved until the hair grew back naturally. Foreign visitors who stepped on a cat in the street were sometimes lynched by mobs before any official could intervene. Even the pharaoh himself could not pardon someone who had killed a cat. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian, recorded one such killing of a Roman soldier in Egypt that nearly caused a diplomatic war. The animal was so sacred that Egyptians who fled burning houses would rescue cats before family heirlooms. Killing a cat was considered worse than stealing temple gold. 2. If you were a pharaoh, you were not allowed to let your hair be seen in public, ever, under penalty of breaking divine protocol. The royal hair was considered a direct connection to the gods, and exposing it would supposedly weaken the spiritual barrier protecting Egypt from chaos. Pharaohs wore the Nemes headdress, that famous striped cloth you see on Tutankhamun's golden mask, specifically to hide every strand. Some rulers even shaved their heads completely and wore ceremonial wigs on top of the headdress for double protection. Servants who accidentally glimpsed the royal scalp could be executed or banished to desert quarries. The headdress was changed daily by priests in a private ritual involving incense and sacred oils. Even in death, the pharaoh's mummy was wrapped with the headdress firmly in place. This rule applied to queens regnant as well, including Hatshepsut, who famously wore a fake beard alongside her covered head. 3. Pharaohs were forbidden from being seen eating or drinking by common citizens because gods on earth did not need to consume mortal food. This rule created an entire class of hidden dining chambers within palaces, complete with separate kitchens and secret passageways for food delivery. Servants who carried meals to these chambers were often selected from deaf-mute populations to prevent any leaked descriptions of royal habits. The king had to maintain the illusion that he was sustained purely by divine energy from the sun god Ra. Foreign ambassadors who attended state functions noticed that the pharaoh would touch dishes ceremoniously, but never actually consume anything in their presence. Real meals happened in absolute privacy, sometimes with food tasters who ate first to check for poison. Breaking this rule by sneaking a peek could result in your tongue being cut out. The illusion was so important that royal banquets were essentially elaborate theater performances. 4. Egyptians were required to mourn the death of the Apis bull with the same intensity as a national tragedy, and the funeral could bankrupt entire towns. The Apis bull was considered a living manifestation of the god Ptah, and only one existed at a time, identified by very specific markings including a white triangle on its forehead. When the sacred bull died, priests began a 70-day mourning period identical to that of a pharaoh. The mummification process used the finest natron, oils, and linens, costing the equivalent of millions in modern currency. Citizens were expected to fast, wear simple clothing, and refrain from celebrations during the mourning. Anyone caught laughing or playing music could be flogged in the public square. The bull was buried in a massive granite sarcophagus, weighing up to 80 tons inside the Serapeum at Saqqara. 24 such bulls have been found there, each entombed with full royal honors. 5. You could not show the soles of your feet to anyone of higher rank, and doing so to the pharaoh meant immediate punishment. The soles were considered the dirtiest part of the body because they touched the ground, which was associated with the underworld. Sitting cross-legged in the presence of nobility was strictly forbidden, and you had to either kneel or sit with legs tucked beneath you. Even tomb paintings were careful never to show royal souls facing toward the viewer or toward important figures. Court officials were trained from childhood in how to position their bodies during audiences with the king. Foreign diplomats received special instruction in this rule before being allowed near the throne. Insulting someone by deliberately showing your soles was a recognized form of declared enmity. The rule extended to statues and reliefs, where artists carefully positioned figures to avoid this offense. 6. Priests were required to shave every single hair from their bodies every 3 days, including eyebrows, eyelashes, and all body hair. This was considered the only way to remain ritually pure enough to enter the inner sanctum of a temple where the god physically resided. Shaving was done with copper razors that had to be purified in sacred water before each use. A priest who entered service with even a single overlooked hair could be expelled from the priesthood permanently. Bathing also had to occur 4 times a day, twice during daylight and twice at night. The priests wore only white linen, never wool, because wool came from animals and was considered impure. They were also forbidden from eating fish, beans, or pork during their service rotation. Greek historian Herodotus described Egyptian priests as the most fastidiously clean people he had ever encountered. 7. It was illegal to fish in certain stretches of the Nile because specific fish species were sacred to specific gods. The oxyrhynchus fish, for example, was sacred in one region but eaten freely in another, leading to actual armed conflicts between neighboring towns. The Nile perch was protected near temples of Neith, while the eel was forbidden near sites dedicated to Atum. Catching the wrong fish in the wrong area could result in heavy fines or imprisonment in mining colonies. Fishermen had to obtain permits that specified which species they could legally take and from which stretches of water. Religious festivals sometimes banned all fishing for weeks, devastating local economies. The phagris fish was associated with the resurrection of Osiris and was protected nationwide. Eating a sacred fish, even unknowingly, required expensive purification rituals to avoid divine punishment. 8. Women were legally allowed to divorce their husbands and own property independently, but they had to follow a precise written procedure or the divorce was invalid. Egypt was remarkably progressive for its time, granting women rights that European women would not see for over 3,000 years. However, the divorce had to be witnessed by at least 3 respected community members and recorded by a scribe on papyrus. The wife was entitled to keep her dowry plus 1/3 of marital property acquired during the union. If the husband had committed adultery, she could claim more, but she had to provide testimony from witnesses. Women who failed to follow the proper procedure could lose their inheritance rights entirely. The rule also worked in reverse, with husbands required to provide written justification for divorcing a wife. Marriage contracts often specified penalties for unfair divorce, sometimes requiring the offending party to pay decades of support. 9. Egyptians were forbidden from killing or harming the ibis bird, sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Like with cats, the punishment for killing an ibis was death, even if the act was completely accidental. The ibis was associated with the moon and with intellectual pursuits, making it the patron creature of scribes and scholars. When ibises died naturally, they were mummified by the millions and stacked in special catacombs at sites like Tuna el Gebel. Archaeologists have found over 4 million ibis mummies in some locations, indicating the scale of religious devotion. Eating ibis meat was considered an unforgivable sin that would prevent your soul from reaching the afterlife. Farmers had to be extremely careful when working their fields to avoid disturbing nesting ibises. The bird's distinctive curved beak was considered to mirror the crescent moon and the writing tools of the gods. 10. Tomb robbery was punished by impalement, but only if you were caught with stolen goods, leading to elaborate hiding methods. The penalty was so severe specifically because tomb goods were meant to sustain the dead person's soul in the afterlife. Stealing them was considered murder of the soul, a crime worse than killing the living. Despite this, tomb robbery was rampant throughout Egyptian history, often involving the very workers who built the tombs. Investigators would interrogate suspects for days, sometimes using torture to extract confessions and recover stolen items. Court records from the 20th dynasty document entire trials of tomb robbers, with detailed lists of confiscated items and witness testimony. Family members of robbers could be enslaved or stripped of citizenship as collateral punishment. The threat of impalement, where a sharpened wooden stake was driven through the body and the victim left to die slowly, was meant to deter even desperate thieves. 11. You could not enter a temple if you had eaten beans within the past few days because beans were considered unclean and capable of corrupting sacred space. The prohibition against beans extended throughout the priestly class permanently, but ordinary worshippers also had to abstain before religious visits. The exact reasoning has been debated, but ancient sources suggest beans were associated with death and the underworld due to their dark appearance and the gas they produced. Pythagoras supposedly adopted this rule from Egyptian priests during his studies in the country. Festival days required even longer abstention periods, sometimes up to a month. Bean farmers were considered second-class citizens in some regions despite the crop being important to the economy. Bread made with bean flour was forbidden in temple offerings entirely. The rule was so deeply ingrained that bean-related insults became the harshest verbal attacks in everyday speech. 12. Pharaohs were required to run a ceremonial race during the Hebsed festival to prove they were still physically fit to rule. This Jubilee festival was held after 30 years of reign and then every 3 years afterward, regardless of the king's actual age. The pharaoh had to run a specific course while wearing a kilt and carrying ritual objects, all in front of an audience of priests and nobles. Failure to complete the run could theoretically result in being deposed, though kings often modified the requirements as they aged. Senusret III ran the course in his 50s and built monuments commemorating his successful completion. Pharaoh Pepi II reportedly ruled for over 90 years and continued performing the ceremony into extreme old age, possibly with significant assistance. The course involved running between markers representing the boundaries of Egypt itself. The ritual was considered so important that even sickly rulers were forced to attempt it. 13. Egyptians were not permitted to mix linen and wool in the same garment, a rule that predates the same biblical prohibition by centuries. Linen was considered pure because it came from the flax plant and represented the gift of the Nile. Wool came from animals and was associated with mortality and earthly corruption. Priests were not allowed to wear wool at all, even outside the temple, and could not be buried in it. Common Egyptians could wear wool, but only as outer garments, with linen always touching the skin. Mixing the two fabrics in a single piece of clothing was thought to invite illness and bad luck. Tailors who created mixed garments could lose their licenses and equipment. The rule also applied to bedding, with sleeping platforms requiring strict separation of materials. Foreign traders had to be inspected at borders to ensure their wares followed the prohibition. 14. Citizens were legally required to give honest testimony during the weighing of the heart ceremony, and lying was considered the worst possible sin. This was not a courtroom rule, but a religious belief that affected daily ethical behavior throughout life. Egyptians believed that after death, the heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. Any lies told during life would weigh down the heart, causing it to be devoured by the demon Ammit. This belief made Egyptian society remarkably honest in commercial dealings, with merchants often refusing to lie even for profit. The 42 negative confessions recited during judgment included specific denials of various lies and deceptions. Court testimony was given under oath to Ma'at, with perjurers facing both legal and spiritual consequences. The fear of an unfavorable judgment shaped behavior in ways that mere laws could not. 15. You could not approach the pharaoh without first prostrating yourself completely flat on the ground with your forehead touching the floor. This was called the proskinesis, and it had to be performed at a specific distance from the throne. Standing in the pharaoh's presence without permission was treated as treason, regardless of the visitor's rank or nationality. Foreign kings sending ambassadors had to instruct them in this protocol or face diplomatic disaster. Even high officials had to perform the prostration when entering the throne room, with only specific titles allowing them to remain seated. The position had to be held until the pharaoh personally gave permission to rise. Some accounts describe officials remaining flat for hours during long ceremonies. Failing to maintain proper humility could result in immediate dismissal from court or worse. 16. Egyptians could not work on certain days deemed unlucky by the priestly calendar, and ignoring these days invited disaster. The calendar included over 50 unlucky days per year, with detailed instructions about what could and could not be done. Some days banned travel, others banned bathing, and some forbade leaving the house entirely. The unlucky days were calculated based on mythological events, such as battles between gods or the deaths of important deities. Workers expected to perform on a forbidden day could legally refuse without penalty. Government projects had to schedule around these days, sometimes causing significant delays. The Cairo calendar papyrus lists every day of the year with its lucky or unlucky status. Children born on certain days were predicted to die in specific ways, which influenced their entire upbringing. 17. Marriage between siblings was permitted and even encouraged within the royal family to preserve divine bloodlines. While taboo for ordinary Egyptians, royal incest was a religious requirement based on the marriage of the sibling gods Isis and Osiris. Tutankhamun married his half-sister, and Cleopatra married two of her brothers in succession. The genetic consequences were significant, with many royal mummies showing evidence of birth defects and weakened immune systems. Tutankhamun himself suffered from clubfoot and a partially cleft palate, almost certainly caused by generations of inbreeding. Despite the medical problems, the religious importance of pure bloodlines outweighed health concerns. Common Egyptians who attempted royal-style sibling marriages faced legal punishment. The rule was technically still in effect during the Ptolemaic period, with Greek rulers adopting the Egyptian custom completely. Some marriages were purely ceremonial, while others produced actual children. 18. Wearing makeup was not a choice, but a legal and religious requirement for both men and women in many social contexts. Kohl eyeliner was considered protection against eye diseases, evil spirits, and the harsh desert sun all at once. The black mineral galena and green malachite were ground into powders and applied with small sticks. Working-class Egyptians were required to wear at least basic kohl when entering markets or temples. The wealthy applied elaborate designs that could take hours to perfect each morning. Specific patterns indicated marital status, profession, or religious affiliation to anyone who could read them. Soldiers wore makeup into battle, believing it protected them from enemy weapons. Archaeologists have found makeup containers in nearly every Egyptian grave, regardless of social class. 19. Egyptians were forbidden from depicting the god Amun's face in profile during certain dynasties, requiring artists to use specific frontal poses. This artistic rule actually broke from the standard Egyptian convention of showing all human and divine figures in profile. The reason was that Amun was considered too sacred and too hidden to be shown in normal artistic conventions. His name itself meant the Hidden One, reflecting his mysterious nature. Artists who violated this rule by depicting Amun improperly could lose their commissions and face religious sanctions. The rule changed significantly during the reign of Akhenaten, who suppressed Amun worship entirely. After Akhenaten's death, traditional artistic rules were restored with even greater strictness. Temple inspectors verified that all new artworks complied with the iconographic regulations. The rule produced some of the most distinctive religious art of the ancient world. 20. You could not refuse to participate in temple festivals if you were a member of certain professions, regardless of personal preference. Bakers, brewers, weavers, and butchers all had specific festival obligations that could not be avoided. Refusing to provide the required goods or services for religious celebrations was considered a crime against the gods themselves. Festival quotas were strictly enforced, with inspectors verifying contributions before celebrations began. The Opet festival required massive amounts of bread and beer, all provided through mandatory contributions. Workers received some compensation for festival labor, but participation was not optional. Foreign workers in Egypt were sometimes exempt from these requirements, creating an odd advantage for non-citizens. Multiple festivals occurred each month, meaning some professions spent significant portions of their working lives in mandatory religious labor. 21. Egyptians could not bury the dead inside cities or settled areas, requiring all cemeteries to be located in the desert beyond inhabited zones. The reason was both practical and religious, as the desert represented the realm of the dead while the Green Nile Valley was the realm of the living. This separation was enforced by health regulations that predated germ theory by thousands of years. Even infant burials had to occur outside city limits, often in specific cemetery zones designated for children. Wealthy families built elaborate tomb complexes in the western desert, where the sun set, and souls began their afterlife journey. The eastern bank of the Nile was for the living, while the western bank was almost exclusively for the dead. Funeral processions had to follow specific routes that minimized contact between the dead and the living populations. Breaking these burial rules was considered both legally criminal and ritually polluting. 22. Pregnant women were required to follow specific dietary restrictions and avoid certain activities to ensure the favor of the goddess Taweret. Taweret, depicted as a hippopotamus goddess, was the protector of pregnant women and newborns. Expectant mothers wore amulets bearing her image and recited specific prayers throughout pregnancy. They were forbidden from eating crocodile meat, fish from certain stretches of the Nile, and any food considered too hot or too cold. Sleeping on the left side was required during late pregnancy, with magical reasons given for the practice. Pregnant women could not attend funerals or come near tombs, as exposure to death was thought to harm the unborn child. Husbands had specific obligations during their wives' pregnancies, including avoiding hunting and certain trades. The rules continued for 40 days after birth, with elaborate purification ceremonies completing the process. 23. Egyptians could not consume wine before a specific time of day, with morning drinking considered both impious and shameful. Wine was associated with religious ceremonies and special occasions, not casual consumption. Beer, on the other hand, was the everyday beverage and could be consumed at any time. Workers received beer rations as part of their wages, with pyramid builders famously getting daily allotments. Wine drinking before noon could result in social ostracism and exclusion from professional guilds. Religious festivals were exceptions, with ritualized wine consumption beginning early in the morning. The vintner profession was considered respectable, but the seller of cheap wine to morning drinkers was looked down upon. Young men were specifically warned against early wine consumption in didactic texts called instructions. The rule reflected concerns about productivity and proper social behavior. 24. You were required to wash your hands before entering any temple, and the water had to come from a specific sacred source. Temple complexes included elaborate bathing facilities with multiple basins for different stages of purification. The water used was either Nile water that had been ritually consecrated, or water drawn from sacred wells within temple grounds. Worshippers had to wash their hands, feet, and mouth at minimum, with more elaborate rituals for important ceremonies. Soap-like substances made from natron and oil were used to ensure thorough cleansing. The order of washing mattered, with specific prayers recited at each stage. Foreign visitors had to be instructed in the proper procedures before being allowed entry. Skipping the purification ritual was considered both an insult to the gods and grounds for immediate expulsion from sacred space. 25. It was forbidden to write the names of certain demons or evil entities in their complete form, requiring scribes to use specific avoidance techniques. The ancient Egyptians believed that writing a name gave it power, so dangerous names had to be either abbreviated, written backwards, or pierced with knife symbols. The serpent god Apep, who threatened the sun god Ra each night, had his name written with special symbols indicating his defeat. Scribes who wrote dangerous names completely could be blamed for any misfortune that followed. Special spells called execration texts involved deliberately writing enemies' names on pottery and then smashing them to harm those people through sympathetic magic. The rule extended to political enemies, whose names could be erased from monuments to prevent them from receiving offerings in the afterlife. This practice, called damnatio memoriae, was applied to figures like Akhenaten and Hatshepsut. Erasing a name was considered worse than physical death, as it destroyed the person's eternal existence. 26. Egyptians could not work as physicians without completing specific training in the House of Life, the temple-based medical schools. Medical practice was regulated by the state, with strict rules about who could treat what conditions. Different specialists handled eye diseases, dental problems, internal conditions, and surgical procedures with no overlap permitted. Practicing outside your specialty could result in losing your license and facing punishment if patients died. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and Ebers Papyrus contain detailed medical knowledge that physicians had to memorize. Greek travelers like Herodotus marveled at the specialization of Egyptian medicine, far more advanced than their own systems. Doctors who lost too many patients faced investigations to determine if they had followed proper procedures. Following the established protocols protected physicians from blame even when patients died, while deviating from them brought legal liability. 27. Soldiers were forbidden from cutting their hair while on military campaigns, leaving it to grow until they returned to Egyptian soil. This rule had both practical and symbolic dimensions, with long hair considered a sign of strength and martial vigor. Returning soldiers performed elaborate ceremonies to cut and dispose of their campaign hair, often offering it to specific war gods. The hair was sometimes used in magical rituals to ensure future military success. Soldiers who broke the rule by cutting their hair early were considered to have abandoned their duty spiritually. Officers had specific styling requirements that distinguished them from common troops, but they too could not cut their hair on campaign. The rule applied even during long campaigns lasting years, leading to dramatic transformations in soldiers' appearances. Some military monuments specifically depict the long-haired returning warriors as a sign of honor. 28. You could not approach the inner sanctum of a major temple unless you held the rank of high priest or above. The inner sanctum, called the Holy of Holies, contained the cult statue of the god, which was considered the actual physical residence of the deity. Only a handful of people in all of Egypt had access to these spaces at any given time. The pharaoh himself was technically the only person allowed to perform the daily rituals, though he delegated to high priests in practice. Lower priests handled outer courtyards, food preparation, and other support functions without ever seeing the central image. Common worshippers never penetrated beyond the public outer halls of major temples. Festival days allowed glimpses of the god during processions but never direct access. The exclusivity created enormous spiritual mystique around the inner sanctum experience. 29. Egyptians could not cross certain bodies of water without paying tolls and reciting specific protective prayers. The Nile and its tributaries were considered the domain of multiple gods, including Hapi, the god of the inundation, and Sobek, the crocodile god. Crossing without proper rituals invited divine punishment, often manifested as crocodile attacks. Toll booths existed at major crossings, collecting fees that supported nearby temples and infrastructure. Ferry operators had specific religious training and were considered semi-priestly figures. The prayers had to be recited in the correct order and dialect, with mistakes potentially angering the river gods. Wealthy travelers hired specialist priests to accompany them on river journeys. Boats themselves had to be ritually purified before each voyage, with specific protective amulets attached to prevent misfortune. 30. Slaves and servants were forbidden from wearing the same clothing colors as their masters, with strict color hierarchies based on social rank. White linen was reserved primarily for priests and the wealthy, while undyed fabrics in tan and beige were for common workers. Specific shades of blue and red were associated with royalty and could only be worn by the royal family or those granted special permission. Servants who appeared in forbidden colors could be beaten or have the offending garments destroyed. Color choice extended to jewelry, with gold reserved for the highest classes and faience pieces for everyone else. The rules created an entire visual language of social rank that everyone could read at a glance. Foreign visitors often violated these rules unknowingly, requiring patient explanation by local hosts. Festival days sometimes relaxed the color codes, allowing temporary expressions of social fluidity. 31. You could not interrupt a scribe while he was writing, regardless of your rank or the urgency of your message. Scribes were considered sacred to Thoth, and their work was essentially religious even when producing mundane documents. Interrupting could cause errors that would invalidate the document, or worse, anger the gods. Scribes carried symbols of their profession, including palettes and reed pens, that signified their protected status. Even high officials had to wait until a scribe finished his current passage before requesting his attention. Apprentice scribes underwent years of training that included learning when and how to acknowledge interruptions properly. The profession was so respected that it offered a path to social mobility for talented commoners. Becoming a scribe was considered the highest possible career achievement for a non-noble Egyptian. Texts called satires of the trades survive that compare scribal work favorably to every other profession. 32. Egyptians were required to leave food offerings at family tombs on specific days each month, and skipping these obligations was a serious crime. The dead were thought to need physical sustenance in the afterlife, provided through these offerings. Specific dates included the Day of Death, monthly anniversary days, and major festival periods. Wealthy families employed mortuary priests called ka servants to maintain the offerings perpetually. Endowment contracts established income streams from agricultural land specifically to fund these eternal offerings. Families that neglected their dead could face haunting and supernatural punishment, according to popular belief. Tomb inscriptions often included curses against descendants who failed to maintain offerings. The economic impact of mortuary cults was enormous, with significant land permanently dedicated to supporting the dead. This system created ongoing employment for priests across thousands of years. 33. You could not name a child without consulting a priest who would determine the child's destiny based on the birth date. Names were considered profoundly important, as they connected a person to specific gods and influenced their entire life. Priests consulted the Cairo calendar and other astrological texts to identify auspicious names. Common name elements included references to gods, pharaohs, or specific virtues. The name choice could later be changed if circumstances suggested the original was inappropriate. Multiple names were common, with secret names known only to family or priests considered most powerful. The secret name was thought to control a person's true destiny and could not be revealed without severe consequences. Knowing someone's secret name gave magical power over them, which is why even the gods kept their true names hidden in mythology. Children given inappropriate names were thought to suffer misfortune throughout life. 34. Egyptians could not cut down certain trees, particularly sycamore figs, without performing specific rituals to release the tree spirit. Trees were considered to house spirits, and major species were associated with specific goddesses. The sycamore was sacred to Hathor, the goddess of love and the sky, who appeared in tomb paintings emerging from such trees. Cutting one without proper ceremony could result in the spirit haunting the lumberjack's family for generations. Sacred groves around temples were entirely off-limits to woodcutters under any circumstances. The penalty for illegal tree cutting included fines, manual labor, and required donations to the temple of the offended deity. Replacement trees had to be planted to maintain the spiritual balance of the area. Different tree species had different rituals, with experts consulted for major harvesting operations. The rules helped preserve essential ecosystems in a desert civilization completely dependent on limited green space. 35. It was forbidden to leave Egypt permanently without the pharaoh's explicit permission, with violators losing all property and citizenship. Emigration was viewed as abandoning the gods and the divine order that protected the country. Common workers were rarely granted permission, while officials and traders sometimes received temporary travel papers. Returning travelers had to undergo purification rituals to cleanse them of foreign contamination. Property was confiscated from those who left without permission, with the proceeds going to temple coffers. Family members of unauthorized immigrants could face restrictions and social stigma for generations. The borders were monitored by garrisons specifically trained to identify and detain those attempting illegal departure. Egyptians who fled to neighboring lands could be the subject of diplomatic extradition requests. The rule reflected Egyptian beliefs that their land was uniquely blessed and leaving was both foolish and impious. 36. You could not lend money at interest higher than rates set by the state, with violators losing the entire principal. Egyptian usury laws were among the most sophisticated in the ancient world, predating similar regulations in other civilizations by centuries. Maximum interest rates varied by loan type, with grain loans permitted higher rates than silver loans. Records of loans had to be filed with state offices, creating an early credit registry. Lenders who concealed loans to avoid taxation could face their entire wealth being seized. Borrowers had specific protections, including the right to repay early without penalty. Defaulting borrowers could lose property, but were generally protected from enslavement, unlike in some neighboring cultures. Loan documents required witnesses and were sealed with the borrower's personal mark. The system supported a sophisticated economy that functioned smoothly across thousands of years. 37. Egyptians were required to participate in canal maintenance through corvée labor, with refusal punishable by fines or imprisonment. The agricultural system depended on a vast network of canals that distributed Nile floodwater across the land. Maintaining these canals required constant labor, especially before the annual inundation. Each region had specific responsibilities for sections of the irrigation network. Workers labored under the direction of nomarchs, the regional governors, for set periods each year. The corvée system allowed ordinary citizens to fulfill obligations through labor instead of monetary taxation. Wealthy individuals could hire substitutes to complete their corvée obligations. Pharaonic monuments were sometimes built using the same labor system during agricultural off-seasons. The canal system was so essential that disrupting it deliberately was considered an act of treason against the entire kingdom. 38. You could not practice mummification without specific training and licensing from the priesthood. The mummification process was considered a sacred art, not a mere technical procedure. Embalmers worked in specific facilities called per nefer, the houses of beauty, located outside settled areas. Different ranks of embalmers handled different aspects of the process, with the highest priests managing the most sacred operations. The 70-day embalming process followed precise protocols dating back to the earliest dynasties. Mistakes during mummification could prevent the deceased from reaching the afterlife successfully. Embalmers were both respected for their crucial work and somewhat shunned because of their constant proximity to death. The profession was often hereditary, with families passing down techniques over generations. Foreign demand for Egyptian mummification services existed, but the priesthood controlled access to the most prestigious procedures. 39. Egyptians could not eat the meat of certain animals based on regional and religious affiliations. The bull was sacred in some regions and eaten freely in others, leading to constant religious tensions. The crocodile was worshipped in towns like Crocodilopolis, but hunted in others, creating impossible situations for travelers. Pork was avoided by priests and the upper classes, but consumed by farmers and workers. Fish prohibitions varied by species and region, requiring extensive knowledge of local customs. Certain birds, including ibises and falcons, were universally protected throughout the country. Travelers had to research local rules carefully or risk serious religious offense. Markets posted regulations about which meats could be sold in different districts. Violating dietary rules could result in social ostracism and exclusion from religious participation. 40. You could not approach a giving birth woman if you were male and not her husband or a designated medical attendant. Childbirth was considered ritually charged and dangerous, with specific protections required for the mother. Traditional birthing chambers were temporary structures built specifically for the labor, called birth bowers. Female relatives and midwives attended the birth, while men remained outside. Magic spells and amulets specifically protected against demons that targeted laboring women. The brick birth stools that women squatted on were considered sacred objects, deified as meskenet. The entire household participated in supportive rituals during the labor. Husbands had specific ceremonial roles after the birth was complete, including the formal presentation of the child. Breaking the seclusion rules was thought to endanger both mother and child supernaturally. 41. It was forbidden to plant certain crops in fields adjacent to temples, with strict zoning regulations enforced by religious authorities. Specific plants were considered offensive to specific gods, requiring complex agricultural planning. Onions, for example, were associated with Osiris and could not be grown near temples to other deities. Lotus and papyrus had specific sacred significance and could only be cultivated in designated areas. The agricultural priesthood maintained detailed records of which fields could grow which crops. Farmers who violated zoning had to destroy crops at their own expense and face additional fines. The rules protected the spiritual integrity of temple complexes from competing divine influences. Seasonal crop rotations had to be approved by religious authorities in zones near sacred sites. The system created some agricultural inefficiencies, but maintained religious order. 42. Egyptians could not gamble in public spaces without a license from the local nomarch. Gambling was popular but heavily regulated, with games like Senet considered both entertainment and religious ritual. Senet pieces and boards have been found in tombs, suggesting the game had afterlife significance. Public gambling houses required licenses and paid taxes on their proceedings. Cheating at gambling was punishable by mutilation in some periods, with cheaters losing the hand they used to manipulate dice or pieces. Gambling debts were legally enforceable up to certain limits, beyond which they were considered unenforceable. Religious festivals sometimes prohibited all gambling activity for the duration of celebrations. Specific games were associated with specific gods and could only be played at appropriate times. The regulations balanced entertainment value against social problems caused by excessive gambling. 43. You could not perform music for religious ceremonies without proper training and credentialing from the temple. Music was considered essential to religious ritual, with specific instruments associated with specific gods. The sistrum, a rattle sacred to Hathor, was played primarily by women priestesses called the chantresses of Amun. The harp was associated with several deities, and required specialized technique passed down through generations. Drums and rattles had specific ceremonial uses that could not be improvised. Mistakes in religious music could ruin entire ceremonies and require expensive repetitions. Musicians were paid in goods and grain through temple endowments. The profession was considered honorable and was open to both men and women, with certain instruments traditionally associated with each gender. Temple music schools trained children from a young age in the complex repertoires. 44. Egyptians were required to recognize the pharaoh as a living god, and any expression of doubt could be considered treason. The divine status of the pharaoh was the foundation of the entire political and religious system. Public criticism of the king was punishable by death, while private complaints could result in exile or imprisonment. Foreign rulers had to acknowledge the pharaoh's divine status in diplomatic correspondence, even if their own religious systems disagreed. The pharaoh's birthday was celebrated as a religious holiday. Statues of the king received offerings similar to those given to traditional gods. The cult of the deceased pharaohs continued for centuries after their deaths, with active priesthoods and regular ceremonies. Foreign occupiers like the Persians and Greeks adopted the system to legitimize their rule. The divine kingship concept was so embedded in the culture that even invaders had to participate in the rituals. 45. You could not enter certain professional guilds without proof of family lineage in the same trade. Professions like sculpture, jewelry making, and metalwork were tightly controlled by hereditary guilds. Outsiders could rarely break into these specialized fields regardless of talent. The guild system protected specialized knowledge and ensured quality standards across generations. Guild masters had to approve new apprentices, with most slots reserved for family members. Some guilds did accept outsiders through marriage into established families. The system created strong professional traditions, but also limited social mobility. Guild membership came with both privileges and obligations, including mandatory contributions to religious festivals. Disputes within guilds were handled through internal courts before being referred to state authorities. The professional structure remained remarkably stable across thousands of years of Egyptian history. 46. Egyptians could not use the personal name of the pharaoh in casual conversation, requiring elaborate circumlocutions instead. The royal name was sacred, and using it inappropriately was considered disrespectful. Common substitutions included His Majesty, the Great House, or the Lord of the Two Lands. Pharaonic names had specific structures with 5 different names for different contexts. Only specific officials could use certain royal names in formal documents. Foreign correspondence required complete knowledge of the proper royal forms. Mistakes could result in returned documents or even diplomatic incidents. The taboo extended even after a pharaoh's death, with deceased kings still requiring respectful naming conventions. Tombs preserved the proper forms for eternal use in the afterlife. The naming protocols reinforced the social hierarchy at every level of communication. 47. It was forbidden to disturb the ka of a deceased person by neglecting their tomb maintenance. The ka was the spiritual double that needed continued physical sustenance after death. Tombs included false doors through which the ka could enter and partake of offerings. Family members had legal obligations to maintain these connections perpetually. Endowments funded mortuary priests to perform the duties when families could not. Failure to maintain the ka caused suffering both to the dead and supernatural retribution to the living. Tomb inscriptions often included direct addresses to passersby, requesting them to recite offerings even if they could not bring physical goods. The practice ensured even the long-forgotten dead received some sustenance from passing literates. Wealthy tombs provided lists of items to recite, ensuring even abandoned graves received proper care. 48. Egyptians could not bathe in the Nile during certain religious periods or in specific sacred stretches. Some sections of the river were dedicated to particular gods and required permission to enter. The crocodile-infested waters near Crocodilopolis required local permits and prayers to Sobek. Festival periods sometimes prohibited all bathing for purification reasons. Sacred bathing pools at temple complexes required ritual purity before entry. Personal hygiene was important to Egyptians, but had to be balanced against religious considerations. Wealthy households maintained private bathing facilities that avoided public waterway issues entirely. The rules sometimes inconvenienced travelers who had to seek permitted bathing locations. Local guides were essential for foreigners navigating the various regulations. 49. You could not refuse hospitality to travelers, as they might be gods in disguise testing humans. The mythological tradition of gods walking among humans created strong hospitality customs. Travelers had to be offered food, water, and shelter regardless of the household's resources. Wealthy families maintained guest quarters specifically for unexpected travelers. Inns existed, but were considered less honorable than home hospitality. The custom protected travelers in a society without modern transportation infrastructure. Refusing hospitality could result in social ostracism and supposed divine punishment. Beggars were sometimes treated with similar respect, as they too could be testing deities. The custom created an obligation network that reinforced social cohesion across the kingdom. Stories of those who failed the hospitality test often became cautionary tales told to children. 50. Egyptians could not destroy or deface the names of dead pharaohs, with specific exceptions for those officially condemned. Names were considered eternal connections between the living and the dead. Most deceased rulers remained sacred figures whose names had to be preserved indefinitely. Specific pharaohs were posthumously condemned, with their names and images systematically erased. Akhenaten and his immediate successors faced this treatment after the religious reforms were reversed. Hatshepsut's monuments were defaced decades after her death by her stepson Thutmose III. The selective application of name destruction made it a powerful political tool. Restoration projects in later periods sometimes attempted to reverse the damage. Modern archaeologists work to identify the original names beneath later alterations. The practice demonstrates how seriously Egyptians took the spiritual power of names. 51. You could not work as a tax collector without specific religious credentials, as the profession involved sacred state functions. Tax collection was viewed as essential to maintaining cosmic order through proper state finances. Collectors had to swear oaths to Maat, the goddess of truth and order. Corrupt collectors faced both legal punishment and supposed divine retribution. The detailed records they maintained were considered religious documents as well as financial ones. Farmers who underpaid taxes faced graduated punishments, while collectors who took bribes could lose limbs. The system supported the massive state apparatus, including pyramids and temple construction. Foreign merchants paid different rate structures than Egyptian citizens. Detailed receipts had to be provided in triplicate, with copies going to local, regional, and royal archives. 52. Egyptians were forbidden from displaying sexual imagery in public spaces outside specific religious contexts. Erotic imagery existed in Egyptian art but was carefully restricted to appropriate venues. The Turin erotic papyrus, perhaps the most famous example, was a private document not intended for public display. Religious imagery sometimes included sexual elements in fertility contexts, which were considered sacred rather than obscene. Public obscenity laws protected children and maintained social decorum. Violators could face fines and public shaming. The rules distinguished between sacred sexuality, which had a place in religion, and casual sexuality, which was kept private. Festival days sometimes relaxed certain rules for fertility celebrations. The careful management of sexual imagery shows Egyptian sophistication about social and religious distinctions. 53. You could not consume certain plants during specific religious periods, with violations requiring purification rituals. Onions were avoided during festivals to Osiris due to their association with the god. Garlic had similar restrictions during certain ceremonies. Lettuce, on the other hand, was sacred to Min, the fertility god, and had to be eaten during his festivals. The plant taboos varied by region and season, requiring careful attention from observant Egyptians. Foreign visitors often violated these rules accidentally and required tolerance from local hosts. Religious experts could advise on proper plant consumption for specific dates. The rules created an annual cycle of food restrictions that structured the year. Markets adjusted their offerings based on the religious calendar. The food taboos reinforced religious observance in daily life. 54. Egyptians could not cut their hair without performing specific rituals based on their social class and gender. Children typically had shaved heads with single side locks, indicating youth. Adults grew hair according to social conventions, with elaborate wigs covering natural hair on formal occasions. Mourners shaved their heads as a sign of grief. Priests maintained complete shaving as a permanent professional requirement. Hair-cutting ceremonies marked transitions in life, including coming of age, marriage, and entering religious service. The cut hair was carefully disposed of through burial or burning to prevent its use in magical attacks. Stylists were specialized professionals with their own guild regulations. The variety of hair customs reflected the complexity of Egyptian social organization. 55. You could not enter the pharaoh's harem if you were male and not directly related to the royal family. The harem was a complex household for royal women that required strict gender segregation. Eunuch attendants handled functions that required male labor within the harem walls. Royal sons could visit their mothers in the harem, but eventually moved to separate quarters. Foreign princesses sent as diplomatic gifts entered the harem and rarely left. The senior wife managed the harem hierarchy, with status determined by birth and the bearing of children. Conspiracies within the harem occasionally threatened pharaohs, with Ramesses III nearly assassinated by harem plotters. The architecture included multiple courts and gardens for the residents. Children raised in the harem received the finest education available in the kingdom. 56. Egyptians were required to maintain specific lighting conditions in homes during religious observances. Lamps had to be lit at sunset and tended throughout the night during certain festivals. The light symbolized the journey of the sun god Ra through the underworld. Failing to maintain the lamps could supposedly disrupt the cosmic order. Special oil and wicks were prepared for these religious lighting duties. Some festivals required specific colored flames produced through chemical additives. The lighting requirements created significant fuel consumption during festival periods. Wealthy households dedicated specific servants to lamp maintenance. The illumination both honored the gods and provided practical security during nighttime religious activities. 57. You could not openly disagree with the priesthood on religious matters without facing accusations of heresy. The priesthood interpreted religious texts and had final authority on doctrinal questions. Independent religious thought was tolerated only within certain limits. Akhenaten's revolution and its violent reversal showed the dangers of major religious change. Common people had limited access to religious texts depending on priestly mediation. Subtle reinterpretation of myths was permitted, but radical reformulation was suppressed. Some philosophical texts engaged with religious questions through indirect approaches. The priesthood maintained intellectual authority partly through control of literacy and texts. Dissident religious movements occasionally arose but were generally suppressed. The system created remarkable religious stability across thousands of years. 58. Egyptians could not work on the pharaoh's monuments without proper authorization and supervision. Pyramid and temple construction required massive organized labor under strict regulation. Workers were not slaves, contrary to popular belief, but free citizens performing rotating service. They received wages in grain, beer, and other goods, with detailed records kept of every transaction. The village of Deir el-Medina housed the artisans who decorated royal tombs. These workers had unusually high status and literacy rates compared to other laborers. They went on what may be the world's first recorded labor strike during the reign of Ramesses III, when rations were delayed. Construction continued during the Nile flood season when farming was impossible. The system efficiently used available labor across the agricultural calendar. 59. You could not sail on the Nile during certain unlucky days as identified in the Cairo calendar. River travel was essential to Egyptian life, but specific dates were considered too dangerous for navigation. The unlucky dates were associated with mythological events, particularly conflicts among the gods. Boat captains consulted calendars before planning voyages. Cargo shipments timed their movements to avoid dangerous dates when possible. Religious processions on the river required especially careful date selection. Forced voyages on unlucky days sometimes occurred for emergencies, with extra protective rituals performed. The calendar restrictions complicated commerce but were generally respected. Modern researchers have found some Cairo calendar predictions correlate with actual weather patterns. The system blended observation with mythology in characteristic Egyptian fashion. 60. Egyptians could not adopt children without going through specific legal procedures. Adoption was permitted but required formal documentation and witnesses. The procedure protected inheritance rights for both biological and adopted children. Adopted children had identical legal status to biological offspring, including inheritance rights. Wealthy families sometimes adopted to secure heirs when biological reproduction failed. Slaves could be freed through adoption, providing a path to citizenship. The adoption process required priestly involvement to ensure spiritual transfer of family connections. Children adopted into different professions had to learn the new family trade. Records of adoptions survive on papyri showing the legal sophistication of the system. The flexibility of adoption helped maintain family lines despite high mortality rates. 61. You could not refuse military service when called up by the pharaoh, with deserters facing severe punishment. Egypt maintained a substantial standing army supplemented by conscripts during major campaigns. Each region had quotas for military service that had to be filled. Wealthy individuals could sometimes purchase substitutes, but service was generally mandatory. Deserters faced execution, with their families sometimes punished as well. Successful soldiers received land grants and other rewards upon discharge. The military provided social mobility for talented commoners. Foreign mercenaries served alongside Egyptian forces in many periods. Specialized units like charioteers required years of training. The army campaigned as far as modern Sudan and Syria during peak imperial periods. 62. Egyptians could not maintain unauthorized shrines in private homes beyond specific small-scale household worship. Major religious worship had to occur at official temples with priestly oversight. Household shrines for ancestors and personal protective deities were permitted at small scales. Unauthorized shrines that grew too elaborate could be considered illegal religious activity. The priesthood maintained control over major religious functions through these restrictions. Personal piety remained important, but operated within prescribed boundaries. Specific household gods like Bes and Taweret had widespread popular followings. The restrictions prevented the rise of unauthorized cults that might challenge official religion. Family religious practices passed down through generations within these limits. The system balanced personal religion against institutional control. 63. You could not engage in trade with foreign merchants without paying specific tariffs and following customs regulations. International trade was tightly controlled at designated ports and border crossings. Customs officials inspected all incoming and outgoing goods. Specific items had import or export restrictions based on strategic considerations. Cedar from Lebanon, for example, was crucial for shipbuilding and tightly controlled. Gold export was generally prohibited except as state-managed payments. Foreign merchants required permits and had to operate through Egyptian intermediaries. Tax rates varied based on the goods and origin countries. The trade system generated substantial state revenue while maintaining economic security. Diplomatic gifts often disguised commercial transactions in the formal record. 64. Egyptians could not destroy religious texts even when they were damaged or no longer needed. Worn-out papyri containing sacred texts had to be ritually buried in specific locations. The rule protected the spiritual content of the writing from desecration. Many archaeological discoveries result from these careful disposal practices. The Cairo Geniza in later Jewish tradition reflects similar concepts of sacred text preservation. Damaged temple inscriptions had to be replaced through formal restoration rituals. The careful handling of religious texts contributed to their survival across millennia. Modern scholars have benefited enormously from these preservation practices. Some texts were recopied multiple times to maintain their existence. The practice demonstrates Egyptian respect for the spiritual power of the written word. 65. You could not approach a sacred animal without performing specific gestures of respect. Sacred animals included not only cats and ibises but also bulls, baboons, falcons, and crocodiles. Each species required specific ritual approaches based on the deity it represented. Visitors to sacred animal preserves had to be instructed by attendant priests. Photography was obviously not an issue, but accurate description for later art required priestly permission. Feeding sacred animals required donations to the maintaining temples. The animals lived in luxury compared to working creatures, with elaborate quarters and constant attention. Their natural deaths triggered elaborate mummification ceremonies. Massive animal cemeteries have been discovered with millions of mummified specimens. The animal cults required substantial economic resources to maintain. 66. Egyptians could not hold certain offices without first serving as scribes for prescribed periods. Scribal training was the foundation of Egyptian administrative careers. Even high officials had to demonstrate writing competence in specific scripts. The hieroglyphic, hieratic, and later demotic scripts each had their own training requirements. Scribal schools admitted boys typically aged 7 through their teenage years. Punishment for poor performance included beatings and food restrictions. Successful scribes could rise to become viziers, the highest officials below the pharaoh. The famous text, The Satire of the Trades, praises scribal life by mocking other professions. Foreign languages like Akkadian were taught for diplomatic correspondence. The scribal system created Egypt's renowned bureaucratic efficiency. 67. You could not participate in the pharaoh's hunt without specific rank and invitation. Royal hunts were both sport and political theater, demonstrating the pharaoh's strength and divine support. Specific animals like lions and wild bulls were hunted only by the king to symbolize his control over chaos. High officials were sometimes invited to participate in supporting roles. Common people lined the hunting grounds to witness royal prowess. The hunt followed specific protocols, including ritual preparations and offerings. Successful hunts were commemorated on temple walls and royal monuments. Tutankhamun's tomb included numerous hunting equipment despite his physical limitations. The desert hunt was distinguished from marsh hunting, each with its own customs. Diplomatic hunts entertained foreign visitors and demonstrated Egyptian power. 68. Egyptians were forbidden from removing or altering boundary markers between fields, with severe penalties for violations. Boundary stones marked agricultural land assignments and were considered sacred. Moving them was the equivalent of theft of land itself. The accurate measurement of fields was essential after each annual flood when boundaries needed restoration. Surveyors called rope stretchers performed the measurements using stretched ropes with specific knot intervals. Their work was overseen by religious authorities to ensure honesty. Disputes over boundaries went to special courts with detailed records and witnesses. Successful manipulation of boundaries could result in capital punishment in serious cases. The careful land management supported the agricultural system that fed the entire civilization. Modern surveying techniques trace some methodological roots to Egyptian practices. 69. You could not sell yourself into slavery without specific approval and documentation. Voluntary slavery existed but was tightly regulated to prevent exploitation. Debtors sometimes entered into temporary slavery to settle obligations. The contracts had specific durations and conditions for release. Slaves had certain legal protections, including the right to marry and own personal property. The treatment of slaves varied by household, with some essentially family members and others harshly treated. Foreign slaves captured in war had different status than Egyptian-born slaves. Manumission was common, with freed slaves often integrating fully into Egyptian society. The system was less brutal than slavery in many other ancient civilizations. Contracts of slavery, freedom, and indenture survive on papyri, showing the legal complexity. 70. Egyptians could not conduct major business transactions without witnesses and proper documentation. Large purchases required formal contracts witnessed by multiple parties. Land transfers needed temple registration to be legally valid. Inheritance disputes were common and could only be resolved through documented evidence. The legal system relied heavily on written records combined with witness testimony. Forgery was punishable by death due to the importance of documents. Storage of important documents in temple archives provided protection against household disasters. The detailed record-keeping enabled the sophisticated economy. Modern scholars have recovered enormous amounts of information from surviving documents. Business law in Egypt was remarkably advanced for the ancient world. 71. You could not engage in adultery without facing severe legal and social consequences. Both genders faced punishment for adultery, though women often received harsher treatment. The traditional punishment for women included physical mutilation or even death by burning. Male adulterers might face fines, beatings, or, in serious cases, mutilation. Marriage contracts often specified the consequences of adultery in detail. Wronged spouses had legal grounds for divorce with full property settlement. Children born of adulterous unions had complex legal status. The harsh penalties reflected the importance of patrilineal inheritance and family honor. Some periods saw more lenient enforcement than others. The rules contrasted with relatively liberal Egyptian attitudes toward sexuality within marriage. 72. Egyptians could not consume the meat from sacrificed animals unless they participated in the religious ceremony. Sacrificed animals were considered to share in divine power after their offering. Distribution of sacrificial meat was a significant economic benefit of priesthood. Common worshippers could receive portions during major festivals. The meat had to be consumed within specific time frames after the ritual. Consuming improperly the leftovers from temple sacrifices could constitute religious offense. Different animals had different distribution rules based on the gods they were dedicated to. The system supported the priesthood while providing protein to the broader population. Festival sacrifices sometimes provided meat to thousands of participants. Elaborate accounting tracked the flow of sacrificial materials. 73. You could not establish a new town without royal permission and specific rituals. Town founding was a religious act as well as a political and economic one. Specific gods had to be honored during the founding ceremonies. The site selection involved both practical considerations and religious omens. Boundary stones were ritually placed and consecrated by priests. The town's name was carefully chosen for spiritual significance. Royal officials supervised the layout to ensure proper alignment with cosmic principles. Public buildings, including temples, had to be planned from the foundation. The careful planning produced remarkably organized urban settlements. Some towns served specific functions like worker villages or military outposts. 74. Egyptians could not own multiple wives unless they could demonstrate sufficient resources to support them. Polygamy was legal, but practiced primarily by the wealthy and the pharaoh. The first wife typically had primary status with subsequent wives in subordinate positions. Each wife had to receive equivalent material support. Children of all wives had specific inheritance rights based on birth order and maternal status. The system was less common than monogamy among ordinary Egyptians. Royal harems represented an extreme version reserved for the pharaoh. Marriage contracts often specified whether subsequent wives were permitted. Divorce remained available throughout polygamous marriages. The institution adapted to economic and social conditions across different periods. 75. You could not engage in certain professions if you were of foreign birth, even if you had lived in Egypt for generations. Sensitive positions, including high priesthood and certain military roles, required Egyptian birth. Foreign-born residents could rise to substantial wealth and status but faced specific career limitations. Naturalization through royal grant was possible, but rare. Foreign communities often maintained their own internal organizations within Egyptian cities. The Greek community of Naucratis represents a famous example of organized foreign settlement. Foreign mercenaries sometimes received land grants and integration into Egyptian society. The career restrictions softened during Hellenistic and Roman periods. Multiple ethnicities lived peacefully within the Egyptian system. The general tolerance contrasted with restrictions on specific positions. 76. Egyptians could not steal from temples without facing exceptional punishment beyond ordinary theft penalties. Temple theft was sacrilege as well as crime, with the doubled status meaning doubled punishment. Cutting off hands, blinding, and other mutilations preceded execution in serious cases. The afterlife consequences were considered as important as the earthly ones. Detailed inventories of temple property allowed precise tracking of any losses. Temple guards patrolled sacred precincts continuously. Workers in temple complexes underwent regular searches and oath-taking ceremonies. The combination of physical security and religious threats limited, but did not eliminate temple theft. Famous cases involving high officials sometimes shocked the entire kingdom. The seriousness of the offense reflected the central role of temples in Egyptian life. 77. You could not perform medical procedures without consulting specific medical texts and procedures. Egyptian medicine was the most sophisticated of its time, codified in texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus. Physicians followed established protocols for diagnosis and treatment. Surgical procedures including trepanation and dental work were practiced with reasonable success. Pharmaceutical preparations used hundreds of ingredients in specific combinations. Magic complemented physical treatment, with spells and amulets prescribed alongside medicines. The texts categorized cases as treatable, possibly treatable, or untreatable, helping physicians manage expectations. Specialists handled different body parts and conditions. The system produced remarkable results given the available knowledge. Greek medical traditions later borrowed extensively from Egyptian practices. 78. Egyptians could not change their social class easily, with specific paths required for any movement between groups. Social mobility was limited but not impossible in ancient Egypt. The scribal profession offered the clearest path upward for talented commoners. Military success could elevate soldiers to landowner status. Marriage between classes was uncommon, but not forbidden. Royal favor could rapidly elevate individuals to high status regardless of birth. The class system reinforced stability across thousands of years. Foreign service sometimes provided opportunities for class transition. Religious careers offered another path for social advancement. The relative rigidity of Egyptian society contributed to its long-term stability. 79. You could not perform autopsies on humans for medical research as this was considered desecration of the body. Mummification involved specific procedures, but was not considered medical research. Medical knowledge had to be gained through external observation, surgery on the living, and animal dissection. The restriction limited Egyptian anatomical knowledge in some areas. However, the sophisticated mummification process did provide significant anatomical information. Greek physicians who later worked in Alexandria broke this taboo to advance anatomical knowledge. The restriction reflected religious beliefs about the integrity of the body for the afterlife. Physicians worked around the limitation through their other available knowledge sources. Despite the restriction, Egyptian medicine remained advanced for its time. The taboo continued in some form until modern times in many cultures. 80. Egyptians could not represent the gods incorrectly in art, with strict iconographic conventions enforced by religious authorities. Each god had specific attributes, colors, and accessories that artists had to reproduce accurately. Mistakes could invalidate the religious purpose of the artwork. Artists trained for years in proper iconography before working on important commissions. The conventions remained remarkably stable across thousands of years of Egyptian art. Innovation was permitted within strict limits, with overall styles evolving slowly. Foreign artistic influences were carefully filtered through Egyptian conventions. Temple inspectors verified all major artworks for accuracy. The careful preservation of conventions makes Egyptian art instantly recognizable today. Master artists were highly respected and well compensated for their specialized skills. 81. You could not refuse to lend essential tools or supplies to neighbors during agricultural emergencies. The interconnected farming system required cooperation across communities. Refusing to help during crises could result in social ostracism. Formal lending agreements existed, but informal cooperation handled most situations. The annual flood timing required all farmers to work simultaneously. Equipment shortages could devastate entire harvests if not addressed cooperatively. Religious teachings emphasized neighborly assistance as a moral duty. The system maintained agricultural productivity despite individual setbacks. Insurance-like community arrangements predated modern equivalents by millennia. Failed cooperation could be punished both socially and through divine displeasure. 82. Egyptians could not consume crocodile meat in certain regions where the animal was considered sacred. Sobek, the crocodile god, was particularly important in the Fayum region. Towns like Crocodilopolis maintained sacred crocodile populations. The meat taboo created complex situations for travelers between regions. Different regional gods had different food prohibitions. The variety of regional taboos reflected the localized nature of much Egyptian religion. Royal pronouncements sometimes attempted to standardize practices. The persistence of local traditions despite centralization is notable. Modern Egypt still has crocodile worship in some southern regions. The taboos contributed to the preservation of certain species in their natural habitats. 83. You could not engage in commerce on certain religious holidays, with markets closed entirely. Major festival days like Wepet Renpet, the New Year, prohibited business activity. The closures allowed everyone to participate in religious observances. Economic disruption was accepted as necessary for spiritual benefits. Workers received their wages on schedule despite the closures. Some festivals lasted multiple days, requiring careful planning. Foreign merchants had to learn the calendar to avoid wasted trips. Festival days often included public feasts provided by temples. The combination of religious observance and economic life shaped daily activities. Modern weekend traditions have ancient origins in similar practices. 84. Egyptians could not break specific contracts without facing graduated penalties based on the violation. Contract law was sophisticated, with detailed provisions for various breaches. Agricultural contracts had specific provisions for natural disasters and crop failures. Trade contracts included delivery dates and quality specifications. Marriage contracts contained terms for various contingencies. The legal system enforced contracts through both monetary and physical penalties. Repeat offenders faced increasingly severe punishments. The reliability of contracts supported the complex economic system. Witnesses played essential roles in dispute resolution. The detailed legal framework was remarkable for the ancient world. 85. You could not approach the king's body parts in art or religion in irreverent ways. The pharaoh's physical body was considered semi-divine. Specific body parts had associations with different gods. The king's name signs included references to body parts in symbolic ways. Tomb inscriptions described the deceased pharaoh's body becoming various divine substances. Disrespecting royal imagery in any form was treason. The careful religious treatment extended to images of the king. Proper depiction required artists to follow strict conventions. The seriousness reflected the divine status of the pharaoh. These conventions remained stable across thousands of years. 86. Egyptians could not abandon pets, particularly cats and dogs, without facing legal consequences. The animal welfare laws were among the most advanced in the ancient world. Domesticated animals were considered family members in many households. Abandonment was punishable by fines and required restitution. Found animals had to be properly cared for or returned to their owners. The legal protections reflected genuine affection for pets. Dogs were particularly valued for hunting, herding, and companionship. Tomb art often depicts beloved pets accompanying their owners. The afterlife was thought to include reunion with cherished animals. The compassion toward animals contrasted sharply with practices in some other ancient societies. 87. You could not access certain sections of libraries without proper credentials and supervision. The House of Life contained extensive collections of religious, medical, and scientific texts. Access was restricted based on professional and educational qualifications. Apprentice scribes worked their way up through increasing access privileges. Foreign scholars sometimes received special permissions through royal grants. The texts included copies hundreds or thousands of years old. Maintenance and copying of texts was constant work for the priesthood. Lost or damaged texts required extensive restoration efforts. The libraries were attached to major temple complexes throughout the country. Access to knowledge was both protected and shared in carefully managed ways. 88. Egyptians could not abandon their assigned regional administrative duties without authorization. Each nome or region had specific officials with defined responsibilities. Abandoning post was treated similarly to military desertion. The administrative system maintained Egyptian governance across thousands of years. Officials received compensation, including land grants and political privileges. Their responsibilities included tax collection, judicial duties, and infrastructure maintenance. Career bureaucrats moved between positions based on merit and royal favor. The hereditary nature of some positions provided stability, but could create problems with incompetent successors. Regional power balanced against central authority through this system. The detailed records produced by administrators provide much of our knowledge of ancient Egypt. 89. You could not engage in espionage against the state without facing immediate execution. State security was paramount given Egypt's strategic position. Border guards monitored movement carefully across all frontiers. Suspicious activities were investigated by specialized officials. Foreign agents faced exceptionally harsh punishments. The detailed information networks throughout the kingdom provided early warning of threats. Egyptians captured spying for foreign powers received the most severe penalties. The threats from neighboring civilizations required constant vigilance. The security state was relatively unobtrusive for ordinary citizens, but devastating for those who threatened it. Diplomatic correspondence sometimes revealed spy networks operating across borders. 90. Egyptians could not consume large quantities of certain spices reserved for religious or royal use. Frankincense and myrrh were imported from Arabia and Africa at considerable expense. They were primarily used in religious ceremonies and royal cosmetics. Common citizens could not legally hoard these spices. Black pepper from India became available in later periods, but remained restricted. Cinnamon and cassia served similar purposes. The trade in these substances was tightly controlled by state authorities. Counterfeit or adulterated spices brought serious legal penalties. The spice restrictions both protected royal revenues and maintained religious purity. Long-distance trade networks supplied these valuable substances to Egyptian elites. 91. You could not paint your home in certain colors without specific permissions in some regions. House colors followed regional and class conventions. White was common for ordinary homes due to its heat-reflective properties. Bright colors might require permits in specific districts. Religious institutions had strict color requirements for their associated structures. Royal buildings featured colors reserved for their status. Foreign settlers sometimes received exceptions to maintain their cultural identities. The color regulations contributed to the visual coherence of Egyptian cities. Modern reconstructions sometimes underestimate the colorful nature of ancient Egyptian architecture. Pigments included expensive imports as well as local materials. The careful management of colors reflected broader aesthetic and social order. 92. Egyptians could not alter major waterways without specific royal permission and engineering oversight. The Nile and its tributaries were too important for casual modification. Major canal projects required royal sanction and detailed planning. Local irrigation modifications had to follow regional regulations. Engineering knowledge was preserved through specialized priestly traditions. The annual flood required predictable water management. Mistakes could devastate entire regions through flooding or drought. The expertise developed over millennia was passed down carefully. Major works, including dams and reservoirs, supported the agricultural system. The careful management of water resources was central to Egyptian civilization. 93. You could not engage in unauthorized mining operations, particularly for gold and copper. Egyptian mineral resources were state monopolies in most periods. Expeditions to remote mining sites required royal authorization and military support. Workers in mines received wages but worked in extremely difficult conditions. Some periods saw convict labor used in mining operations. Smuggling of precious metals was punished severely. The mining areas in the Eastern Desert and Sinai were administered by specialized officials. Production figures were carefully tracked from extraction through processing to final products. Foreign powers occasionally raided mining areas during periods of weakness. The mineral wealth supported much of Egypt's prestige economy. 94. Egyptians could not approach the king without proper announcement through intermediaries. The royal court had elaborate protocols for granting audiences. Petitioners might wait months or years for personal access to the pharaoh. Officials prioritized requests based on political importance. Wealthy and well-connected individuals had advantages in gaining audience. Common citizens rarely, if ever, spoke directly with the king. Royal officials handled most administrative matters without involving the pharaoh personally. The protocols served to maintain royal mystique and prevent overwhelming demands. Foreign ambassadors had specific procedures for their introductions. The hierarchical access maintained the divine kingship system. 95. You could not celebrate certain festivals without participating in specific rituals. Festivals included both joyous celebration and mandatory religious observance. The beautiful festival of the valley honored the dead through visits to family tombs. The Opet festival celebrated the renewal of royal power. The Koyak festival commemorated Osiris's death and resurrection. Different participants had different roles based on age, gender, and social position. Skipping required participation could bring social and supposedly divine consequences. Festival foods included specific items associated with the celebrations. Music and dance accompanied most major festivals. The annual cycle of festivals shaped time perception and community life. 96. Egyptians could not maintain unauthorized burials within urban areas due to public health concerns. Burial regulations dating back to early periods kept the dead separated from the living. Ritual reasons reinforced practical concerns about disease and water contamination. Cemetery zones in the Western Desert handled all burials. The funeral industry developed specialized professions for transport and burial. Wealthy families purchased perpetual care contracts for their tombs. Pauper burials in mass graves served those without resources. Foreign visitors who died in Egypt received expedited handling for repatriation. The careful management of death contributed to Egyptian longevity and health. Modern medical understanding validates many of the ancient burial practices. 97. You could not engage in practices considered chaotic or against Ma'at without facing both legal and spiritual consequences. Ma'at represented order, truth, justice, and cosmic balance. Lying, theft, and violence all violated Ma'at principles. The 42 negative confessions in the Book of the Dead enumerated specific Ma'at violations. Daily life ideally embodied Ma'at in every action. The pharaoh's primary religious duty was maintaining Ma'at throughout the kingdom. Civil law derived from Ma'at principles. Punishment of crimes restored Ma'at balance. The concept influenced everything from personal ethics to international relations. Egyptian civilization endured partly because of this strong moral framework. 98. Egyptians could not perform unauthorized building modifications to homes without permits. Residential construction followed both practical and religious guidelines. Specific room arrangements followed proper feng shui-like principles. Window placements considered both practical light and supernatural protections. Shrine areas required priestly consecration. Modifications had to maintain proper relationships between living spaces. Permits for major changes required local official approval. The building codes contributed to the consistency of Egyptian architecture. Wealthy homes had additional restrictions based on their status. The careful management of domestic space reflected broader social order. 99. You could not ignore the rules of bread and beer production, which were considered both economic and religious. Bread and beer formed the foundation of the Egyptian diet. Production methods were carefully regulated for quality and safety. Bakers and brewers followed specific recipes that varied by occasion. Religious ceremonies required specific bread types prepared in particular ways. Beer of various strengths served different social functions. The basic daily ration for workers was a specific number of bread loaves and beer measurements. Quality control was maintained through guild oversight and official inspections. Foreign visitors marveled at the variety and quality of Egyptian bread and beer. The fermentation process involved religious as well as biological understanding. 100. Egyptians could not cross the desert routes without proper preparation and permits. Caravan travel required substantial supplies and protection. Specific routes had been established and maintained over millennia. Wells and oases provided crucial way stations along the routes. Bandits and hostile foreign powers threatened unprotected travelers. Caravan masters obtained government permits before departure. Insurance-like arrangements sometimes covered losses on dangerous routes. The trade in luxury goods from sub-Saharan Africa relied on these routes. Religious shrines along the routes provided spiritual protection for travelers. The careful management of desert travel supported Egypt's long-distance commerce. 101. You could not consume food prepared by ritually impure persons without facing spiritual consequences. Cooks and kitchen staff for important households underwent purification rituals. Menstruating women were considered ritually impure in some periods, though Egypt was less strict than some neighboring cultures. Mourners after burials could not prepare food for others. Sick individuals had to be excluded from food preparation. The purity rules contributed to relatively good public health. Restaurants and food vendors had specific licensing requirements. Religious dietary laws applied to certain professions and life events. The rules reflected sophisticated understanding of disease transmission combined with religious frameworks. Foreign cuisines sometimes faced suspicion due to unknown preparation methods. 102. Egyptians could not engage in unauthorized magical practices outside specific religious contexts. Magic was considered a real force that required careful management. State-sanctioned magic by priests was permitted and even encouraged. Folk magic in households was tolerated within limits. Black magic intended to harm others was punished severely. Specific spells targeting the pharaoh were treated as treason. The line between acceptable and unacceptable magic was carefully maintained. Wise men and healers operated within prescribed boundaries. The pyramid texts and coffin texts contained spells preserved for proper religious use. Magical practitioners received training and licensing in some periods. The careful management of magic balanced practical needs against social order. 103. You could not refuse to participate in court testimony when summoned by officials. Witnesses played essential roles in the legal system. Refusing to testify could result in penalties as serious as the original alleged crime. Detailed records of court proceedings have survived in many cases. The principle of seeking truth through testimony was central to justice. Both common citizens and officials could be summoned as witnesses. Religious oaths added supernatural force to legal testimony. False testimony was a serious offense with severe consequences. The legal system relied on the integrity of citizen participation. Court records show sophisticated legal reasoning across thousands of years. 104. Egyptians could not engage in unauthorized representation of foreign gods within Egypt. Imported religions required official approval to operate openly. Foreign communities maintained their own religious practices in designated areas. The Greek god Serapis was specifically created in the Ptolemaic period to bridge Egyptian and Greek religion. Foreign priests had to register with Egyptian religious authorities. Worship of foreign gods by Egyptians was discouraged through various means. The state preferred to manage religious diversity rather than suppress it entirely. Major foreign deities like Astarte from the Levant had Egyptian counterparts or adoptions. The careful management of religious pluralism maintained social order. Cultural exchange occurred within these regulated frameworks. 105. You could not engage in certain arts without specific apprenticeships in the established schools. Artistic training was rigorous and tightly controlled. Master artists passed down techniques through extended apprenticeships. Specific schools developed regional and stylistic identities. Royal commissions required artists from approved schools. The conservative nature of Egyptian art reflected this training system. Innovation was permitted within established frameworks. Foreign artistic influences were carefully filtered through Egyptian conventions. Some artists became wealthy and famous within the system. Their names sometimes survive in inscriptions on their works. The artistic traditions remained recognizable across thousands of years. 106. Egyptians could not avoid the annual census without facing penalties. The census was crucial for tax collection and military planning. All households had to be counted with detailed information about residents. Wealth assessments determined tax obligations. Failure to participate or providing false information was punished. The census was conducted by specialized officials with detailed protocols. Records were maintained at multiple levels of government. Foreign residents were also counted with specific notations. The information allowed sophisticated state planning across generations. Modern census procedures have ancient predecessors in Egyptian practices. The system supported efficient governance of a complex society. 107. You could not engage in unauthorized currency exchange before the introduction of standardized coinage. Egypt operated on a barter and weight-based system for most of its history. Standard weights of copper, silver, and gold determined value. Cheating with weights was punished severely. Foreign coinage entered Egypt during the Persian and Greek periods. Exchange rates between Egyptian standards and foreign coins required official supervision. Money changers had specific licenses and oversight. The Ptolemaic period saw the adoption of true Egyptian coinage. Counterfeit currency was treated as treason. The careful management of value supported the sophisticated economy. 108. Egyptians could not work in certain professions without ritual purification. Some jobs were considered ritually polluting and required special handling. Embalmers worked with the dead but had elaborate purification routines. Tanners and leather workers handled animal bodies and required cleansing. Toilet cleaners and certain construction workers had similar requirements. The pollution beliefs did not necessarily reflect class status but ritual conditions. Professional purification typically involved bathing and prayer. The system allowed essential but unpleasant work to be performed without spiritual contamination spreading. Marriage between members of polluting professions and others was sometimes restricted. The careful management of ritual purity contributed to public health. 109. You could not engage in unauthorized exploration of the desert beyond established routes. The deserts surrounding the Nile Valley contained both dangers and resources. Mining areas were strictly controlled by the state. Religious sites in remote locations received protection. Foreign incursions sometimes penetrated the deserts. Permits required for travel beyond settled areas. Guides familiar with desert conditions accompanied authorized expeditions. The deserts were sometimes seen as the realm of dangerous gods. Caravan routes provided most of the legitimate desert travel. The vast desert areas remained largely unexplored by ordinary Egyptians. Modern archaeological discoveries continue to reveal unknown ancient activities in remote desert locations. 110. Egyptians could not engage in unauthorized historical revision or recording. Historical records were essentially official documents controlled by the priesthood and state. Royal annals were carefully composed to present desired versions of events. Successful coups sometimes resulted in extensive historical revision. The erasure of specific pharaohs from historical records demonstrated this control. Foreign accounts sometimes preserved alternative versions of events. The careful management of historical memory served political purposes. Archaeologists and historians today work to reconstruct events through multiple sources. The selective preservation of records affects our understanding of Egyptian history. Some periods are far better documented than others due to these practices. 111. You could not abandon the religious obligations to your ancestors, with these duties continuing across many generations. The mortuary cult required ongoing care for deceased family members. Endowments funded perpetual maintenance for elite tombs. Ordinary citizens maintained more modest, but still important ancestor obligations. The continuation of these duties demonstrated family piety and social standing. Failed obligations could supposedly bring supernatural consequences. The economic impact of mortuary cults was significant across the entire civilization. Specific dates required offerings, gifts, and prayers. Modern descendants in some Egyptian communities maintain shadows of these ancient practices. The careful preservation of ancestor connections contributed to family stability across generations. The continuity between living and dead defined much of Egyptian existence. That brings us to the end of our journey through the strangest rules of ancient Egypt. From cats that could get you killed to bread that fed both the living and the dead, this civilization built a world where every action carried cosmic weight. If you enjoyed this deep dive, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments which rule shocked you the most. Until next time, History Hunters, stay curious.